It was a humid morning in Ouagadougou, May 2025, when Ibrahim Traoré received an urgent call from his intelligence chief, Colonel Derman Arago. "Mr. President, we have intercepted communications that will shock the world. It involves the American Vice President, JD Vance." Ibrahim, at 36, had learned to stay calm under pressure. But something in Germain's voice made him pause. "What exactly are we talking about, Colonel?" he asked, walking to his office window, overlooking the bustling capital of Burkina Faso. "Sir, we have recordings of private conversations between Vance and foreign arms dealers. They discuss weapons shipments to terrorist groups in the Sahel region." Ibrahim's jaw tightened. For years, his country had fought against terrorism while receiving limited support from Western allies. "Are you certain of the authenticity?" "Yes, sir. Our cyber intelligence unit has verified everything. The recordings are crystal clear." Ibrahim knew this information could change everything. JD Vance, the American vice president, had publicly criticized African leaders for their inability to handle security issues. Now, evidence suggested he might be part of the problem. "Schedule an emergency cabinet meeting in 1 hour," Ibrahim ordered, "and prepare our secure communication systems. We need to contact our allies immediately." As he prepared for the meeting, Ibrahim reflected on the irony. Western leaders often lectured Africa about corruption and governance. Yet here was evidence of American complicity in the very terrorism plaguing his region. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife, Ajara. "The children are asking when you'll be home. I told them Daddy is working to keep them safe." Ibrahim smiled grimly. Indeed, he was about to do exactly that, but in a way that would shock the entire world. The presidential cabinet room in Ouagadougou was tense as Ibrahim's top ministers gathered around the mahogany table. Colonel Ludrigo entered with a secure laptop and several encrypted files. "Gentlemen," Ibrahim began, his voice steady, "what you're about to hear will fundamentally change our relationship with the United States." The colonel opened the laptop and played the first recording. JD Vance's voice was unmistakable. "The African situation works in our favor. The more unstable the Sahel becomes, the more dependent they are on our military contracts." A second voice, identified as arms dealer Marcus Wheeler, responded, "Our friends in the terrorist groups are ready for the next shipment. They'll create enough chaos to justify increased American military presence." Foreign Minister Dr. Alans Soadugo nearly dropped his coffee cup. "Mr. President, this is evidence of treason by the American Vice President." Ibrahim nodded gravely. "There are 12 more recordings spanning 18 months. Vance has been orchestrating instability in our region to profit from arms sales and justify American military expansion." Defense Minister Colonel Qasem Kibali leaned forward. "Sir, with respect, how do we know this isn't disinformation?" "The Americans have sophisticated capabilities because," Ibrahim replied, "our intelligence comes from their own NSA systems. A whistleblower inside the American government provided these recordings to expose Vance's corruption." The room fell silent. Everyone understood the implications. This wasn't just about corruption. It was about the deaths of thousands of innocent Africans. "What's our strategy, Mr. President?" asked Dr. Sawado. Ibrahim stood up, his military bearing evident. "We're going to expose this to the world, but we'll do it strategically. First, we contact our African allies. Then, we reach out to credible international media. Finally, we present the evidence in a way that cannot be dismissed or ignored." He paused, looking at each minister. JD Vance thinks Africa is his playground. Today, he learns that we are nobody's pawns. Within hours of the cabinet meeting, Ibrahim's secure phone was buzzing with calls from across Africa. President Macky Sall of Senegal was the first to respond. "Ibrahim, if this is true, it changes everything. Senegal stands with you completely." From Nigeria, President Bola Tinubu was equally supportive. "Brother, we've lost too many soldiers fighting." Terrorism? If Americans are feeding the beast, the world must know. By evening, 15 African heads of state had joined a secure video conference from Ouagadougou. Ibrahim presented the evidence methodically. This recording from January shows Vance coordinating with Wheeler to delay peace negotiations in Mali. This one from March discusses using terrorist attacks to justify American military base expansion in Niger. The reaction was swift and unanimous. "This is worse than colonial exploitation," said President Félix Tshisekedi of the Democratic Republic of Congo. "They're literally profiting from our people's deaths." Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., JD Vance was preparing for a routine cabinet meeting, unaware that his world was about to crumble. His press secretary, Amanda Collins, briefed him on the day schedule. "Sir, you have the Defense Appropriations meeting at 2 p.m. Then the African Policy Review at 4 p.m. Vance, confident and dismissive, replied, "The African thing is just routine. These people need constant hand-holding." What he didn't know was that his communications had been monitored for months. The NSA whistleblower, Dr. Sarah Chen, had grown disgusted with Vance's corruption and secretly documented everything. Back in Burkina Faso, Ibrahim was finalizing his strategy. "We'll hold a live international press conference tomorrow at 3:00 p.m. local time. I want every major news network present." His communications director, Yakuba Traoré, was already coordinating with international media. Mr. President, BBC, CNN, Al-Azhar, and France 24 have confirmed attendance. "We'll have global coverage." "Good," Ibrahim nodded. JD Vance has treated Africa like his personal ATM. Tomorrow, the world learns the truth about American foreign policy in our region. The morning of May 20th, 2025, dawned with unusual activity in Ouagadougou. International journalists were arriving at Thomas Sankara International Airport while security teams prepared the presidential palace for what would become a historic press conference. Ibrahim Traoré stood in his private office, reviewing his presentation one final time. His aide, Moussa Cabaret, entered with updates. "Mr. President, we now have 89 international journalists confirmed, including correspondents from the New York Times, Washington Post, and Reuters." The BBC's Africa correspondent called this the most anticipated press conference in African history. Ibrahim nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. "And our technical team, everything is ready, sir. The audio files are verified. The documentation our cybersecurity experts are by to authenticate everything in real time." Indeed, in Washington, JD Vance was having breakfast with his wife Yusha, standing completely unaware of the approaching storm. "Honey, I have that African policy meeting today." "Should be routine," he said, scrolling through his phone. These small countries always need something. What Vance didn't realize was that his own intelligence services had been infiltrated. Dr. Sarah Chen, the NSA whistleblower, had spent months documenting his illegal activities. Her conscience could no longer bear the weight of American complicity in African terrorism. Back in Burkina Faso, President Tinubu of Nigeria had arrived to show solidarity. "Ibrahim, what you're doing today will change the course of African history. We're tired of being treated like chess pieces in other people's games." President Macky Sall joined them via secure video link. The evidence is irrefutable. Vance has blood on his hands. At 2 p.m. local time, 1 hour before the press conference, Ibrahim received a call from an unexpected source. Former President Barack Obama. If it's authentic, know that not all Americans support this corruption. Ibrahim was surprised but grateful. "Thank you, Mr. Obama. This isn't about America versus Africa. It's about truth versus lies." At exactly 3:00 p.m. Ouagadougou time, Ibrahim Traoré walked into the packed press conference room. The atmosphere was electric, with journalists from 45 countries present. Camera flashes illuminated the presidential seal of Burkina Faso as Ibrahim approached the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen of the international press," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived military coups and terrorist attacks. "Today I present evidence that will shock the world about American foreign policy in Africa." He gestured to a large screen behind him. For 18 months, the American Vice President, JD Vance, has been secretly coordinating with arms dealers to fuel terrorism in the Sahel region. This isn't speculation. This is documented fact. The first audio recording played through the speakers. Vance's voice was unmistakable. The beauty of the African strategy is that chaos creates dependency. The more unstable they become, the more they need our military solutions. Gasps echoed through the room. Sarah Johnson from CNN was furiously taking notes, while James Mitchell from the BBC was already texting his editors. "This is the biggest story of the decade," he whispered to his cameraman. Ibrahim continued methodically, playing recording after recording. Each one revealed deeper levels of corruption and cynicism. In this conversation from February, Vice President Vance discusses delaying humanitarian aid to maximize the impact of terrorist attacks. In his words, hungry people make better recruits for extremists. The room was stunned into silence. Even veteran war correspondents looked shocked. In Washington, JD Vance was in his office when his chief of staff, Robert Hayes, burst in. "Sir, you need to see this immediately. The president of Burkina Faso is playing recordings of your private conversations on live television." Vance's face went pale. "That's impossible. Our communications are secure, sir. He has 18 months of recordings. Everything about the arms deals, the terrorist coordination, the humanitarian aid delays, everything." For the first time in his political career, JD Vance felt genuine fear. His carefully constructed image was crumbling in real time, broadcast to the entire world. Within minutes of Ibrahim's revelations, social media exploded. Vancegate became the #1 trending topic globally, with millions of shares and comments. The recording spread faster than wildfire across platforms. In Washington, President Trump was immediately briefed on the crisis. "Sir, this is a disaster," said his chief of staff. "Vance's approval ratings are dropping by the minute. Congress is already talking about impeachment." Trump, known for his political survival instincts, made a quick decision. "Get me a secure line to President Traoré. We need to contain this immediately." Back in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim was fielding questions from the international press. "Mr. President, how did you obtain these recordings?" asked a reporter from The Guardian. A courageous American whistleblower, Dr. Sarah Chen from the NSA, provided them. She could no longer watch her government profit from African suffering. The mention of an NSA whistleblower sent shockwaves through the intelligence community. In Langley, Virginia, CIA Director Burns was in emergency session with his senior staff. "We need to find Dr. Chen immediately. This is a national security crisis." Meanwhile, JD Vance was in damage control mode. His press secretary, Amanda Collins, was fielding hundreds of calls from journalists worldwide. "The vice president categorically denies these allegations," she stated, but her voice lacked conviction. The evidence was too overwhelming. European leaders were quick to respond. French President Macron tweeted, "If these allegations are true, France stands with our African partners. Corruption in foreign policy is unacceptable." German Chancellor Scholz called for an immediate NATO investigation. In London, Prime Minister Sunak demanded answers from the American ambassador, but the most powerful reaction came from within America itself. Senator Bernie Sanders held an emergency press conference. "If these recordings are authentic, JD Vance has committed treason against American values and humanity itself." The Democratic Party leadership, sensing opportunity, immediately called for Vance's resignation. House Speaker Jeff announced the formation of a special investigative committee. By evening, protests had erupted outside the White House. Americans were horrified to learn that their government was potentially funding the very terrorism they claimed to fight against. The morning after Ibrahim's explosive revelations, the political landscape had shifted dramatically. JD Vance's approval ratings had plummeted to 12%, the lowest ever recorded for a sitting vice president in Congress. Both Republican and Democratic leaders were distancing themselves from him. Senator Mitch McConnell, typically loyal to Republican leadership, issued a statement. "These allegations, if proven true, represent a fundamental betrayal of American values and our African partners." In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim was receiving calls from world leaders. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, was on the line. President Traoré, the Security Council, is calling an emergency session. "Your evidence has created a constitutional crisis in America." Ibrahim remained composed. "Secretary General, we simply presented the truth. America's reaction is their own responsibility." Meanwhile, the NSA whistleblower, Dr. Sarah Chen, had gone into hiding. But her lawyer released a statement. Dr. Chen acted out of conscience. She witnessed systematic corruption that was costing innocent lives and could no longer remain silent. The FBI had launched a manhunt for her, but civil rights groups were calling her a hero. In Washington, President Trump was facing the biggest crisis of his presidency. His advisors were unanimous. Vance had to go. "Sir, he's toxic now," said his political strategist. Every minute he remains in office damages your administration. But Trump was reluctant to abandon his vice president. JD has been loyal. I can't just throw him under the bus, Mr. President. He threw himself under the bus. We have the recordings. The international community was demanding answers. The African Union called an emergency summit in Addis Ababa. President Moussa Faki Mohammed issued a statement. The evidence presented by President Traoré confirms our worst fears about Western involvement in African instability. China and Russia were quick to capitalize on the crisis. Beijing announced increased investment in African infrastructure, while Moscow offered military assistance to Sahel countries. The global balance of power was shifting, and America's credibility was in freefall. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim was meeting with his cabinet to discuss the next phase of their strategy. We've exposed the corruption, he told his ministers. Now we must build alternatives. 3 days after the initial revelations, the U.S. Congress had moved with unprecedented speed. The House Judiciary Committee announced formal impeachment proceedings against JD Vance, while the Senate prepared for what would be the most watched political trial in American history. Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller, III, was appointed to lead the investigation. The evidence presented by President Traoré is substantial and credible, Mueller stated in his first press conference. We will follow the facts wherever they lead. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim was coordinating with international investigators. His palace had become a hub for justice, with FBI agents, Interpol officials, and UN investigators all working together. This is bigger than just JD Vance, Ibrahim told the investigative team. Our intelligence suggests a network of corruption involving multiple American officials and defense contractors. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed millions of dollars flowing from American defense companies to offshore accounts linked to terrorist groups. Communications revealed a systematic plan to destabilize the Sahel region for profit. Dr. Sarah Chen, the NSA whistleblower, had finally agreed to testify before Congress via secure video link from an undisclosed location. I have over 200 hours of recordings, she told the committee. This conspiracy goes to the highest levels of government. JD Vance, meanwhile, was fighting for his political life. His lawyer, David Shan, argued that the recordings were taken out of context. My client was conducting legitimate intelligence operations, he claimed, but the evidence was too clear. In one recording, Vance explicitly states, "The more chaos we create, the more weapons we sell." It's a perfect business model. Public opinion had turned decisively against him. A CNN poll showed that 78% of Americans believed Vance should resign immediately. Protests continued daily outside the White House and the vice president's residence. International allies were demanding explanations. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg called for an emergency Atlantic Council meeting. If these allegations are true, they represent a fundamental breach of alliance values. He stated the European Union was considering sanctions against American officials involved in the conspiracy. In Africa, the response was swift and unified. The African Union announced the suspension of all military cooperation agreements with the United States, pending a full investigation. By the end of May 2025, JD Vance's position had become untenable. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Public support had evaporated, and even his closest allies were abandoning him. The final blow came when his own former chief of staff, Robert Hayes, agreed to cooperate with investigators. I can no longer defend actions that I know to be criminal, Hayes stated in his testimony before Congress. The vice president knowingly funded terrorism for personal and political gain. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim was watching the proceedings with satisfaction, but no joy. Justice is being served, he told his wife Ajara, but this should never have happened in the first place. President Trump, facing mounting pressure and devastating poll numbers, finally made the inevitable decision. In a televised address to the nation, he announced, "I am asking for the resignation of Vice President JD Vance, effective immediately." The evidence presented against him is too serious to ignore. Vance's resignation letter was brief. I resign from the office of Vice President of the United States, effective immediately. I maintained my innocence, but recognized that my continued service would be detrimental to the country. The resignation didn't end his legal troubles. Federal prosecutors immediately announced criminal charges, including conspiracy, arms trafficking, and terrorism financing. The trial would be the biggest political scandal in American history. In Africa, the reaction was mixed. While there was satisfaction that justice was being served, the damage to American credibility was severe. President Macky Sall of Senegal summed up the continental mood. This vindication is bittersweet. How many lives were lost because of this corruption? Ibrahim, meanwhile, was already looking forward. We've exposed the truth, he told his cabinet. Now we must build a better future for Africa. The international community rallied around the young Burkinabe president. The Nobel Peace Prize Committee announced he was under consideration for his role in exposing the conspiracy. European leaders were lining up to visit Ouagadougou, eager to establish new partnerships, with a man who had changed the course of international relations with courage and integrity. 6 months after Ibrahim Traoré's shocking revelations had indeed changed. JD Vance was serving a 25-year sentence in federal prison, convicted on all charges related to his terrorism conspiracy. The trial had revealed the full extent of the corruption, implicating dozens of officials and defense contractors. In Washington, President Trump had appointed a new vice president and was working to rebuild America's credibility in Africa. His first official act was a formal apology to the African continent, delivered in person during a state visit to Burkina Faso. President Traoré, Trump said during the ceremony in Ouagadougou, "Your courage in exposing this corruption has made both our nations stronger. America is committed to being a true partner to Africa." Ibrahim, now 37, and recognized as one of the world's most influential leaders, accepted the apology with dignity. "Mr. President, this was never about America versus Africa. It was about truth versus lies, justice versus corruption." The impact of the scandal had been profound. American foreign policy in Africa had been completely restructured with new oversight mechanisms and transparency requirements. The defense contractors involved in the conspiracy had been dismantled and their assets redistributed to African development projects. Dr. Sarah Chen, the NSA whistleblower, had been granted asylum in Switzerland and was writing a book about her experience. "Ibrahim Traoré saved my conscience," she said in interviews. "He showed the world that truth matters more than power." In Burkina Faso, the changes were remarkable. The country had become a model of good governance and regional stability. International investment had poured in, infrastructure was booming, and terrorism in the Sahel had declined dramatically without American interference. Ibrahim's approval ratings in his own country remained above 90%, but he remained humble. "We simply did what was right," he told his children one evening. Sometimes standing up to powerful people is the only way to protect the innocent. The Nobel Peace Prize Committee had indeed awarded him the honor, recognizing his extraordinary courage in exposing international corruption and his commitment to African dignity and development. At Saint-Tropez, Ibrahim Traoré had become the youngest recipient in the award's history. His story had inspired a new generation of African leaders, proving that the continent could defend itself with intelligence, courage, and moral clarity.